Miriam.
Hi, I'm Frank.
Hi, I'm Annette. Hi, I'm Kayla.
Hello, I'm Danny.
And our topic is on gentrification in Fort Greene.
Gentrification is the process of renewal and rebuilding accompanying the influx of middle-class or affluent people into deteriorating areas that often displaces poorer residents. In short, it is the displacement of poorer and often minority people from their homes, in which they might have lived for a lengthy period of time, or even generations. This displacement is caused by more affluent people, who tend to be white, moving in and renovating the area, driving up prices, the cost of living, especially rent. The people who cannot afford these increases in prices, have no choice but to move to more low-income areas until the cycle happens again. This tour will examine an area in which this very phenomenon has occurred, Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and how gentrification has affected specific aspects of the neighborhood.
As we assessed Fort Greene for topics to write about, we noticed that a new Whole Foods had opened up. For us, seeing that Whole Foods in a neighborhood that had been neglected by the government for years was an embodiment of how gentrification can affect a neighborhood. We began to discuss about the different ways that gentrification has affected our communities and realized that, apart from the business aspect of it, we didn't know how deeply gentrification can change a community. This sparked our interest to research about the different ways that gentrification can look like in a neighborhood. We decided to look at how gentrification has affected the art community, local businesses, the environment, education, and the general public's perception of the neighborhood.
Fort Greene today is dramatically different from the neighborhood it was at conception. Although now it has solidified its position as a neighborhood in late-stage gentrification, this was not always the case. Fort Greene used to be home to industry. In the early half of the 20th century, the Brooklyn Navy Yard nearby was home to many companies. The yards demanded skilled labor and provided middle-class stability to the workers they employed in return. Much of Fort Greene was black and middle class at the time because of the security provided by these jobs. The neighborhood suffered waves of unexpected economic downturn as well as poor policy choices, which the black middle class was especially vulnerable to. The Great Depression sent waves of people into unemployment and propelled further relocation to Fort Greene by black communities from elsewhere. Because of banking practices and red taping, many of these individuals were not able to secure mortgages and become homeowners, further exacerbating cycles of intergenerational poverty. The neighborhood was pushed further into decline, followed by trends of white flight and the boom of suburbia. City planning later designated much of Fort Greene for development and began assigning land to be condemned. This became a major blow to the Brooklyn Navy Yard because companies were skeptical of remaining in the area. As a result, much of the manufacturing industry relocated elsewhere, further plummeting the Fort Greene into economic despair. Development was often stalled due to disagreements with city planning and failure to secure investment. Later in the 20th century, Fort Greene became more attractive to suburbanites relocating to the city and city dwellers who could not afford city prices. Now, the area has seen a projection into the aforementioned and multifaceted late-stage gentrification. As the demographics of the area changed, obvious markers popped up in forms of luxury, real estate, and shops. They have popped up in the aesthetics of the neighborhood and the environmental health of the area, and they have popped up in more localized economies such as small businesses. But markers are not always so clear. In subtle ways, the history of gentrification in the area has been reassessed and challenged by gentrification. For example, the area has been challenged on its education front and by the art produced by it.
Throughout the history of gentrification, it is known to affect the original inhabitants of the place of focus, which in this case is Fort Greene. Many of the original inhabitants of Fort Greene were made up of lower-class African Americans. These same lower-class African Americans are the ones that are being affected as more affluent individuals are coming to live in Fort Greene. As the cost of living in Fort Greene rises, the poorer inhabitants are pushed out. Further throughout the tour, you will see the shift of how Fort Greene was like that compared to what it has changed to now. Not only are the community members different, but the community and its dynamic has changed as well. The different places in the tour will also serve as a looking glass for how the city has also taken its toll on the old lower class inhabitants, and how it has helped push gentrification further into Fort Greene.
Gentrification in Fort Greene is rather odd and quite unique. There seems to be many conflicting opinions from those who inhabit the neighborhood. For example, I'd interviewed both NYCHA residents and residents from the surrounding area, and they solely spoke of the benefits that gentrification provided in the neighborhood, namely the safer streets and the diversity brought to Fort Greene. Every interviewee that I'd interviewed neglected to mention any negatives until provided with examples of negative impacts. Even then, those interviewees had said that those negatives did not outweigh the positives. Annette's interviewees were unaware that gentrification had taken its toll on the neighborhood. Miriam's interviewees were wholly against the gentrification process and made it rather clear during the interviews. Frank and Kayla's interviewees were a mixed bunch. A few were for, many were indifferent, and then there are those who were against. The mix of people with differing thought to the matter is not unique, but the overwhelming number of low-income residents claiming that the neighborhood had improved drastically and that they're open to future development and integration is surprising. Many interviewees had spoken about integration and their openness to welcome new residents to the area as long as they do not worsen the neighborhood. But by that, they mean in terms of crime. This trait is unique in New York City, where in gentrified neighborhoods there seems to be an animosity directed at yippies and gentrifiers.